you say that the argument that is taught that like, oh, made a deal with the devil, partnering with Stalin. It's not really taught that way in America. If you point out that Stalin was Stalin and what he did, somehow suddenly that World War II narrative is a lot less clean.
So recently, Michael Malice went on the Winston Marshall show to reveal the true legacy of Joseph Stalin, why he isn't depicted the way he should be in the United States, and what is driving this. What's at the heart of our culture that depicts Stalin as so much more palatable than, say, Hitler? Let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So Malcolm Muggeridge, who I've read a little bit, he was someone who was a Guardian journalist. He went over to the Soviet Union. He wrote a novel about it.
Winter in Moscow. It's very hard to find. Recently reprinted.
He was someone who did have the courage to come out.
And Gareth Jones.
Who was Gareth Jones?
Oh, so Gareth Jones was friends with, who was the last Liberal PM? I'm blanking his name. Lloyd George.
Lloyd George during the war.
Okay.
The First
Lloyd
World
George.
War.
So he was buddies with Lloyd George. He was a young man, Gareth Jones. Using his connection with Lloyd George, he went to the USSR in the early 30s. And this was when the Holodomor was happening, when there was no grain in the Ukraine and people were starving in huge numbers. But the reporting was everything. I cover this extensively in the White Pill. Everything's fine. Everything's great. Nothing to see here. So Gareth Jones, like a good newspaper man, is like, I'm not going to trust what the people in power are saying. So it was illegal to visit the countryside. So he took a train, got off early, and walked through the different villages. And he saw the same thing in every village, and they all said the same thing. No one's coming to help us. We're all starving. Please tell our story. And that's what he did. And there was a huge movement headed by Walter Duranty, who was head of the press corps in Moscow, by Western journalists to discredit what he said. And Lloyd George even was like, oh, I had nothing to do with this. So it was real. And he was murdered, I think, the day before his 30th birthday in, I believe, Mongolia or somewhere in China. He paid the price for it. So he was probably the most courageous of any of these figures. I talk about him as well at length in The White Pill.
Duranty's covered a lot in a book by Ashley Rinsberg about the New York Times.
Oh, I know that.
Was very much
The Grey Lady Winked.
Correct. And he very much an apologist for what was going on at that time in the Soviet Union.
So what's really disturbing is after all the truth about the Holodomor came out and all the death and all the sadism, it wasn't just evil, it was cruel as well. It wasn't just they were killing people, like they were being sadistic about it.
Yeah, no doubt. Walter Duranty and the New York Times were at the heart of the cover-up of the Holodomor, an event that claimed somewhere between 2 million and 10 million lives in Ukraine in the early 30s. This was Stalin's starvation campaign to bleed those people dry of food and grain to feed the rest of the Soviet Union because of the absurd and backward economic practices, because the new economic policy that Lenin, instituted temporarily to actually bring about more privatization because of his initial failings and his initial attempt to drive Russia into kind of a communist-style proletariat government, the dictatorship of the proletariat, like Marx said. He instituted the new economic policy that was abandoned, and Stalin ransacked that area through this starvation campaign. It's not known about to even the West today. Duranty's denial of this was palpable, and it's really reminiscent of some of the times that the New York Times would say, hey, all this stuff you're saying about the Hunter Biden laptop and the COVID regime is just conspiratorial nonsense.
It wasn't just starving.
So they would go...
It wasn't just famine, it was...
But here's how it worked. Your own body would betray you, because if I see on your face that you're not losing weight, I know you're hiding food. So that means I come to your house in the middle of the night, and if I see a pot with a boot in it that you're boiling for food, what they would do is not only would they spill out the soup on the floor, they would also break the pot to make sure you're not breaking the law. So this was starvation by design. And it was just completely, swept on the rug. So So years later, Duranty admitted, oops, I got it wrong. He wrote to Sulzberger, who was the head of the New York Times, and goes, hey, I've been out of work and the guy gave him a check for like 6 months' salary, something crazy like that. I've got the figures in the white pill. But you would think that this guy who brought so much disrepute to the New York Times with covering up one of the biggest stories of the 20th century, an actual genocide, although there's debate whether it's a genocide or not, you would think, dude, were you giving us a black guy in perpetuity?
Yeah, and it wasn't the last time the New York Times was given a black eye in perpetuity. Of course, that legacy media, including the New York Times, is dying now, but this is an example where there was a cover-up on behalf of journalists, one of the closest connected journalists to the mainstream of opinion in the United States, denying the Holodomor. And like I said, it claims somewhere between 2 million and 10 million lives, and this is outside of all of Stalin's other purges, his purges of the military, the officership. He was paranoid constantly that people within his regime would overtake him, overthrow him, or challenge his authority. And this is one of the most catastrophic and evil policies ever unveiled upon the masses.
Like, we cannot be... Nope. Here you go. Thanks for the hard work.
Yeah, quite astonishing. I noticed recently that Stalin was deemed amongst Russians as the most popular, the greatest Russian in Russian history. So it seems to me there's an odd retelling of what's gone on in history. So we've discussed a little bit about the sort of Western apologia for what happened then, but the Russians themselves have a different connection with this time. And I don't know how you would make.
Well, he's looked at as their Churchill, the guy who stood alone essentially for a time against Hitler and eventually defeated Hitler, paying the largest price for it in terms of men, and that might explain it to some extent. Of course, he has a mixed legacy in that regard. He's looked at, as the Abraham Lincoln of the United States. Well, Abraham Lincoln, if you ask me, plunged about a million people to their deaths over an issue that could have been settled peacefully and didn't have to be a civil war.
Make sense of that if you had insight of trying to understand how Stalin is regarded amongst Russians today.
I think I can steelman that position pretty easily. And this is something that is kind of not discussed as much in the West for pretty obvious reasons. The amount of sacrifice, unnecessary by the way, that the Russians made during World War II is extraordinary. It's much more than the British had to deal with. Not that the Blitz wasn't the picnic, and certainly in terms of amount of men lost, nothing compared to what the United States had to deal with. Yeah. The Siege of Leningrad, for people who don't know, is the longest military siege in world history. And the fact that the citizens of that city survived it in any kind of numbers is nothing short of miraculous and a great testament to the survival of the human spirit.
Yeah, and it's not just Leningrad. I think the Battle of Stalingrad had the most casualties still of any battle in history. Check me on that if I'm wrong. And you had the battle in Kursk, these major battles that were bloodbaths, with Russians losing millions of men eventually to overtake, finally, Hitler in 1945. It was the Russians that got to Berlin before the Americans and the British. So, yeah, I mean, they paid the ultimate price. I guess Stalin is the propaganda beneficiary of that victory, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, if anything, because of the multitudes that they lost. Not that that was anything that Stalin wasn't used to after his purges in the Holodomor.
So there's a very famous picture, which people can look up, called Raising the Flag Over the Reichstag, because the Russians got to Hitler's bunker first. And they raised the hammer, stars and stripes. They raised the hammer and sickle over the Reichstag. I don't remember how many millions of Russians lost their lives, both as a result, civilians and military. It's extraordinary.
I think it's about 10 to 20 million.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that number is actually conservative and underreported.
Yeah, actually, a lot of historians think it was somewhere between 25 million and 30 million Russians lost their lives during World War II. So that makes the losses of the Americans something like, I think, 450,000 or 500,000, just look small. Of course, every loss in life, especially a war that was that absurd and didn't have to happen and was a ramification of the aftermath of World War I, the Versailles treaties, etc. It's just insane. It's immeasurable. It's hard to even contemplate the loss of men, a lot of which was felt by the Russian side, actually the majority of which.
they wanted to kind of hush it because Stalin lost so many because he never thought in his wildest dreams Hitler would betray him.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you look in that context, we're the ones who won World War II. It's very easy to make that case. If you just take it out of context entirely.
So because he defeated Hitler,
I think, and won World War II, yeah, that was the big victory.
Yeah, I mean, you see this effect to some extent in China, too, because China lost something like 15 to 20 million people in World War II also, being attacked by the Japanese. First, the Japanese invaded Manchuria and then China proper. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek kind of put aside their differences temporarily in a civil war to come together to fight the Japanese. Mao eventually emerged triumphant, of course, as we all know, in 1949, but he was the beneficiary of this to some extent, too, this propaganda that, there was a victory. Of course, Mao and the Great Leap Forward in the Cultural Revolution were as disastrous or more in some ways than Stalin's purges, too.
The West didn't learn the right lessons with regards to the East and with what was going on under Stalin, like they did with Hitler.
That's correct.
And it seems, well, I wonder what your take on that was, why you think that was, why there was this different relationship here with that ideology.
There's a big part of history that's taught to the masses that is good guy, bad guy. In fact, when Syria just fell not that long ago, I remember a lot of people being like, oh, is this good for us or bad for us? Maybe it doesn't affect you at all. Maybe both sides hate you. Maybe both sides like you. But it has to be binary, good guy, bad guy.
Well, whatever we think of that question, it is an Al-Qaeda emir, the guy who founded Al-Qaeda in Syria that now leads that country, Jilani. He's right. I mean, these civil wars and the culminations of battles in other countries might not affect you that much, but when the U.S. pours in money in essentially what's a treasonous operation to fund ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, he called it Al-Nusra, that's what he founded it as there, Jilani, to be triumphant, it's a treasonous policy, whether you like it or not, and a lot of times it's on behalf of Israel, because Israel wanted Assad deposed for a long time. Same with the neocons in the United States, by the way. It wasn't just Israel and Netanyahu.
And you say that the argument that is taught that made a deal with the devil, parting with Stalin. It's not really taught that way in America. It's more like, yeah, Stalin did bad stuff, but you sweep that under the rug. It's not really part and parcel. And in fact, during the war, it was heavily censored by the government in Hollywood. They worked together to make sure Russia was presented the best possible light. And this was very much considered a part of the war effort. I talk about that also in the book. There were movies and they had someone from Washington looking over, don't present them as breaking treaties or being dishonest, something like that. This was a big, big deal.
Because they were your allies.
Our allies, yeah. You undermined the war effort. So,
yeah, I mean, Hitler was treated as the supervillain. He was, in many ways, a supervillain of World War II, and his atrocities are just unimaginable. So were Stalin's, though, but they had to propagandize the American people to get behind this war effort on the side they wanted to be, because of Pearl Harbor and other things, by the way, was preempted by the U.S. oil embargo, which made Japan have essentially no choice, not absolving Japan of wrongdoing. It's wrong to murder civilians in any cases, but there were events that precipitated that and made Japan believe that had to happen. A lot of recent scholarship shows that FDR likely knew the attack was coming too and wanted it because he wanted to enter into World War II, but that's another story. Michael Malice is largely correct here. They needed a war campaign not only to villainize the opponent, which they always do. They still do this. They do this in Ukraine. They do this in Gaza. They do this in every avenue and theater that the U.S. is involved in. They have to actually demonize the opposition and rise the allies to a rank that they don't always deserve. They did this in 1980s with Saddam Hussein, by the way, as the Reagan administration funded Iran against their war, or Iraq against their war with Iran.
So I think a part of that is if you point out that Stalin was Stalin and what he did, somehow suddenly that World War II narrative is a lot less clean.
But doesn't that change quite rapidly at the political level after the war with Truman and McCarthyism? And there's a kind of
Well, McCarthy's the best. So if you listen to leftists, McCarthyism is the worst thing that ever happened to America other than slavery. The one time leftists get canceled and they still haven't gotten over it. So
but Truman gets elected by the people, so
sure,
so
52, yeah.
yeah, in 52. So it is the case that he's openly he wins, democratically wins.
No, sorry, 48. He got elected. Sorry.
That they know that he's anti-communist. So the American people vote for a guy that they know is anti-communist, right? So you're just referring to the one portion of society.
No. Sorry. So Truman wasn't a McCarthyist. McCarthy was obviously Senator McCarthy, Joe McCarthy. He was in the 50s. And what he's regarded as is that he was accusing lots of innocent people of being communists and their reputations and lives were ruined. And this was this red hysteria. And oh my goodness, clutching of pearls. So it's still constantly talk about like these poor innocent people. But as I make plain to point out, and as Ayn Rand pointed out, it's not like voting for the Green Party here. The Communist Party of America was taking direct orders from Moscow, from Stalin, from an evil dictator who killed millions of people, including.
Yeah, this was literal Russian influence in government, not that absurd Russiagate hoax, that farce that was hoisted upon and propagandized to the American people for 2 to 3 years. This is absolutely true. If you read about the Venona papers, which were finally revealed and redacted and released in the mid-1990s, it shows that McCarthy was right about many of the people he accused of being communist agents, including Harry Dexter White, the second highest official in the Treasury Department, and there's evidence that Truman even knew about this and then gave him a promotion after that to head either the IMF, I think the IMF after that. The fact that Duncan Lee, the founder and director of the OSS, that's the precursor to the CIA, was a literal Russian agent. The fact that Alger Hiss, the man who was exposed as an agent by Whittaker Chambers, stood alongside the Allied powers in Yalta, deciding how to carve up the European world after World War II. Lachlan Curry, there were others that McCarthy focused on. He was predominantly worried about communist officials in the government that were essentially behaving in a treasonous manner. Not even individual communists and people that were part of the party that weren't in government. He was concerned about the people that were in government. He did have shortcomings, don't get me wrong, but he certainly isn't the arch villain that the mainstream talks about today. If you want a good book on this, read M. Stanton Evans' book on McCarthy. It's fantastic.
Including children and so on and so forth. So this presentation that these were men and women of conscience who just had a different perspective is completely whitewashing the actual situation. And that's not at all to defend McCarthy. And the term itself is a little bit disingenuous because McCarthy was a senator, but their biggest issue is with the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was obviously in the House, not the Senate.
Right.
So it seems to me that if that information might have been known, but it wasn't widely known.
Well, the secret speech, 56. What Khrushchev said, it's all. The thing is, the second Stalin died, they start tearing down the gulags. Like it was very much him and his will, and they started de-Stalinized. They blew up. There was this gigantic statue of him in Prague that took like 20 years. I don't know how many years to build. Double check it on me. But they bombed it. They dynamited it. You know, you can still see. I think the feet are still up, something like that. So very quickly, it was this huge movement of like, we're going to pull back on this insane level of totalitarianism. We're at a 10. We're going to go down to a 9. It depends on the country. Like Romania later got worse. North Korea is obviously a huge example of the contrary. And this is also a big reason of the conflict between the Soviet Union and China. Because Mao was very much a totalitarian in Stalin's vein. He was even worse than Stalin in many ways, where the Soviet Union, relative to China, was far more liberal.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There was a gradual de-Stalinization effort beginning with Khrushchev and, you know, him being open about the fact that Stalin had committed mass atrocities. He wasn't perfect and we're not going to continue his policies. And that is true. That's something that a lot of Americans don't know. The same thing is true in China, where the policies of Mao Zedong were disregarded to some extent, at least by Deng Xiaoping when he took power in the late 70s and, you know, proceeded to open China to trade in a major way after Nixon had traveled there, established good relations earlier in the 70s. And that's something that's worth noting. But the characterization of Stalin is so much more clean, I think, than Hitler's, because the U.S. was allied with Stalin in World War II. They allowed Stalin to take control of half of Europe, with Churchill playing a major role in this in a private meeting in Moscow where he basically scratched down some napkin math and deferred a large amount of the territory in Eastern Europe to Stalin. Pat Buchanan talks about this in his book. But Stalin really, there's a great case to be made, was the real, supervillain of World War II. That's not to say anything about glowing about Hitler. He was certainly a supervillain. You could say Mao was a supervillain. You could say Tojo and the Emperor in Japan were a supervillain. You could say that FDR and his war policies was a supervillain. These are, governments acting against each other, and there's nothing more true about government than that it's the monopolization of force. They all had conscription, a form of slavery. There's many things that bound a lot of those countries together, and it produced a mass slaughter of people in the hundreds of millions. Something like 150 million, I think, died in World War II. It's just outrageous. It's hard to even imagine today. But Michael Malice is right. You get this sugar-coated image of Stalin largely because his atrocities are glossed over. American children only learn about things like the Holocaust, not the Holodomor. They only learn about Hitler's atrocities, his expansion. They don't learn about Stalin's purges as much, or the Great Leap Forward, or the Cultural Revolution in China. That happened after World War II. But I think, Malice makes some great points here. His book, The White Pill, is excellent, just fantastic. I highly recommend you getting it. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below, why do you think Stalin's reputation in the United States is so much better than Hitler's? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Winston Marshall. This was a great interview. Thank you, Winston. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.